Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're pulling up a stack of source material to take us straight into the complex and often brutal history of Nyasaland. That's the British protectorate that eventually became the independent nation of Malawi.
And this is a really deep dive into a lot of internal contradictions. We're going to be unpacking a colonial entity defined by, well, relentless resistance, for one thing, also intense demographic pressures, and a decades-long struggle over the single most important resource land.
Right. And our mission here is to move beyond just a tumbled timeline for you. We want to zoom in on the specific historical forces at play. So we're focusing on the massive colonial land seizures, the really unique population dynamics. You've got immigration and massive labor export happening at the same time, and a tense political journey that finally delivered sovereignty in 1964.
Yeah, and the context is key. Nyasaland was formally established in 1907, replacing the older British Central Africa Protectorate. But its history is immediately set apart because of the political situation it was later forced into.
You mean the Federation?
Exactly. The hugely unpopular Federation of Rhodesia and Nyasaland, which lasted from 1953 to 1963. But what this deep dive will show is that the roots of that national resistance were laid down right at the very beginning.
And you see that resistance almost immediately. I mean, just 8 years after the protectorate was formalized in January 1915, Reverend John Chilembwe staged a rebellion. It was a direct response, a powerful protest against forced labor, against the indignity of the whole system.
And although Chilembwe's rebellion was quickly crushed, it really wasn't a failure in terms of influence. It immediately forced colonial authorities to reassess and often soften their policies. They suddenly recognized this latent volatility just beneath the surface. It was a shock to the system.
Okay, so if you really want to understand the structure of colonial Nyasaland, you absolutely have to start with the land.
It was the single most contentious issue, foundational. The early history is just marked by this massive loss of African communal lands, the process known as land alienation.
And the sources, let us put a number on that.
What they do. Between 1892 and 1894, a staggering 3.7 million acres were alienated. This land was transferred to European-owned estates through these things called certificates of claim.
3.7 million acres. That represented about 15% of the total land area of the entire protectorate.
Right.
But the number itself doesn't even tell the whole story. The critical detail here is that a huge chunk of that 15% was the best arable land, the most fertile plots, and is located specifically in the densely populated Shire Highlands, where people needed every inch of ground just to survive.
Precisely. And this created a vicious cycle. The settlers who got these huge estates suddenly needed labor.
But they didn't want to import it.
No, they wanted to leverage the population already living on that land. So African residents were often encouraged to stay, but now they had to pay rent to the new estate owner.
Which created the notorious system known as fangata.
Fangata. It essentially meant rent was paid not with cash, but with labor. Usually it was fixed at about 2 months of work a year. In practice, though, estate owners always found ways to lengthen that period. It turned these tenants into a kind of permanent, indentured workforce.
And that's where the colonial administration steps in, supposedly to regulate it. But what they do often just cements the exploitation in law. There's a 1928 ordinance that fixed maximum cash rents at £1 for an 8-acre plot, which sounds like a reform on the surface.
It does, but when you dig into the mechanics, you see it's all structural manipulation. It was a clever strategy. So while the cash rent was low, the owners could and did charge much higher equivalent rents in kind. They'd demand crops or goods worth, 30, maybe 50 shillings.
So way above the £1 cash maximum.
Exactly. The goal was to discourage cash payments entirely. That way you force the tenants to pay in labor and the estates get their guaranteed workforce.
It was a perfect system for exploitation. And even with these limited reforms, the estate owners had immense power.
Oh, absolutely. They could legally expel up to 10% of their tenants every 5 years.
With no reason given.
No cause at all. And this constant displacement just fueled resistance. You see these major refusals to quit in Blantyre District in 1942 because, where were these people supposed to go?
So the continuous riots and disturbances, they finally make the situation politically untenable for the British. The Abrahams Commission is set up in 1946.
And it basically recognized that the only solution was to reverse the alienation. The commission proposed that the Nyasaland government should actively purchase unused or underused freehold land for African resettlement.
And this massive land reacquisition program, it really ramps up from 1948 right up until independence.
It does. By the time 1964 rolls around, only about 422,000 acres of European-owned estates are left, mostly concentrated in tea-growing areas. So in historical sense, the government had managed to claw back the majority of the land lost 70 years before. But even with that land reacquisition, the pressure was only increasing because of these profound, almost paradoxical demographic shifts. The population just exploded.
It did. It doubled between 1901 and 1931.
Which sounds like a really robust, naturally growing population. But the source materials are clear. It's deceptive. High infant mortality, disease. It all restricted the natural rate of increase to, what, 1 or 2% a year?
Yeah, it was very low. So if the population was doubling, the question is, where were all the people coming from?
Right.
And the growth was overwhelmingly driven by immigration, mainly from Mozambique. The 1921 census already showed over 108,000 Anguru. That's the Lumwe-speaking immigrants from Mozambique. And this inward flow just continued. So much so that by the 1966 census, about 70% of all foreign-born Africans in Malawi were from Mozambique.
It's interesting to think about the legal status of everyone here, native and immigrant alike. None of them held actual British citizenship. They had this lesser status of a British protected person.
And there was even this bizarre court case in 1929 trying to define what a native was.
What did it say? It concluded a native was defined by blood in one's veins. Specifically, a native of Africa who is not of European or Asiatic race or origin. So it's an identity defined by what you're not.
And that inward flow of families was then counterbalanced by this massive outward drain of labor.
A huge drain. Overwhelmingly adult men heading to the mines and farms of southern Rhodesia and South Africa. This export of labor becomes a defining feature of the economy.
And a major problem for Nyasaland's own development. The numbers really show you the human cost. I mean, estimates from 1937 suggest over 90,000 adult males were working abroad. And here's the detail that gets me. A quarter of those men were thought to have had no contact with their families for more than 5 years. Just gone.
And by the eve of independence in 1963, that outward flow had peaked. We're talking an estimated 170,000 men working abroad. That's a huge portion of the entire able-bodied male population just missing from the domestic economy.
So that brings us to the domestic economy itself. I mean, the one those 170,000 men were missing from.
Well, there were no real economic mineral resources. Coal was there, but it was never exploited. So the economy rested entirely on agriculture.
And the Colonial Department of Agriculture had this clear bias. They heavily favored the European planters.
They did. And more than that, they failed to promote African agriculture. They often discouraged traditional practices like shifting cultivation, which, given the poor soil, was actually the most effective technique.
So they were undermining food security from the get-go.
Pretty much. Initially, coffee was the main estate crop, but it collapsed by 1905 due to competition and drought. So the planters pivoted to tobacco and cotton.
But with tobacco, we see this really surprising inversion in the sources. The European estates, they mainly produced low-grade stuff, and their numbers just plummeted. From 229 growers in 1919 down to just 82 by 1935.
Right, because what happened was that African farmers stepped in dramatically. They were supported by the Native Tobacco Board, formed in 1926, and they just rapidly increased production of fire-cured tobacco. The transformation was stunningly fast. By 1936, Europeans produced only 16% of the national crop. That's down from 86% just 12 years earlier.
That's incredible. It shows the capacity of local farmers when they're given even a little bit of support.
Absolutely.
But all of this growth was constantly fighting against this massive barrier of transport costs. Nyasaland is landlocked, right?
Yeah.
It's nowhere closer than 200 miles to a port.
And the early railway involved multiple transshipments. It was slow, it was expensive, it kept the entire economy really inefficient.
Even after the Zambezi Bridge was finished in 1935.
Yeah, even then. That created an uninterrupted rail link, but the freight rates stayed up to 3 times higher than in Rhodesia or East Africa. That high cost was just a constant brake on any real economic growth.
So you have to ask yourself, with this relentless push for cash crops, what was happening to food security?
Well, seasonal hunger was common. But in 1949, when the rain stopped early, it just spiraled into severe food shortages, especially in the Shire Highlands.
The same area that lost its best land.
The very same. The resulting famine of 1949-50 was devastating. And while the official death toll was claimed to be low, maybe 100 to 200 deaths, the true number was likely much, much higher. It always is.
So all these deep, pervasive frustrations, land loss, the fangata system, economic stagnation, it all paves the long road to sovereignty. After the early jolt of the Chilembwe uprising, the political scene matures. You get these educated African elites forming associations.
which culminates in the Nyasaland African Congress, or NSC, in 1944.
But the real galvanizing factor was external. It was the establishment of the Federation of Rhodesia and Nyasaland in 1953.
Yes, the Federation was profoundly, universally unpopular among Africans in Nyasaland. Leaders feared, and rightly so, that it would lead to permanent political domination by southern Rhodesia's white minority.
And the extension of their harsh, racially discriminatory laws.
Exactly. So when the initial NAC leadership failed to stop it, a younger, more militant generation revived the party. And they made a key strategic move. They invited Dr. Hastings Banda, who had been living abroad for decades, to return in 1958 and lead the movement.
And Banda comes back with this platform demanding immediate constitutional change and, crucially, immediate independence from the Federation.
Right. And as the political agitation and protests grew widespread and increasingly violent, the governor felt he was losing control. So in March 1959, he declares a state of emergency Operation Sunrise and arrests Banda and over 1,300 others.
And the public justification for this was the so-called murder plot. The colonial secretary claimed there was a plan for a massacre of Europeans, Asians, and moderate Africans. This moment is the political turning point. The British government, trying to manage the international scandal, appoints the Devlin Commission to investigate.
And the commission's findings are fascinating. They found that, yeah, based on the disorder, declaring a state of emergency was justified to restore order. But, and this is the critical part, they absolutely, completely rejected the existence of any formal murder plot. They acknowledged there had been talk of beating and killing Europeans, fueled by anger, but they stated emphatically this was not of cold-blooded assassination or murder.
Which was huge. It publicly discredited the whole justification for the mass arrest.
It did. That report exposed the deep structural failings of the Nyasaland administration. It proved they'd lost the support of pretty much the entire African population.
Once that was out in the open, the British government realized the Federation couldn't be maintained. It was just politically impossible.
So Banda was released in April 1960. The nationalist movement, now the Malawi Congress Party, wins a massive victory in the 1961 elections, and that sets the stage for rapid decolonization. Nyasaland achieves internal self-government in 1963, and then full independence on July 6, 1964, renamed Malawi.
So we've traced this incredibly difficult journey. From a protectorate founded on the expropriation of prime land and the fangata system, through this unifying resistance against the Federation, and finally to independence under Hastings Banda.
And the story of Nyasaland is just such a powerful case study of how political aspirations are constantly buffeted by economic and demographic realities. You see mass resistance born from land disputes, the reliance on cash crops, that suffocating cost of transport.
And those complex population dynamics.
Yeah.
The Anguru immigration on one side and the enormous debilitating labor drain on the other.
Exactly.
That labor drain in particular, it really stands out. I mean, when we consider the massive number of able-bodied men, 170,000 by 1963, who were forced to seek work elsewhere, think about this. How profoundly did the economic necessity of exporting your most productive citizens shape the foundational challenges, the resource base, and the development priorities of the newly independent nation of Malawi?
It's a structural challenge that began long before 1964, and its echoes, well, they remain a critical factor in the nation's stability even today.